I'm Jeff from Three Old Guys, and we're going to continue our World War I review with this game, Grande Guerre. It was actually produced by the French. There was a French design team that created this back in 1996. What you're looking at is the second edition, which was produced in 2002, which clarified some of the rules. It's a complex game, but it covers every facet of World War I in almost as much detail in terms of events and activities as Death in the Trenches did, but in fact gives you as the leader of the country a good deal more power over those events. So we'll talk about that in a moment, but first let's take a look at the box. There's the cover, there's the back. You can see we have over here a French description of the game, and over here a translation of that French description, which it's always interesting to read translations, so let's put it that way. It was originally produced by Azure Wish, and it's a very complete game. We'll go ahead and open it up, and we'll start with the maps here. So let's move that out of the way. Once again, we have a situation where Europe, of course, is the vast majority of the place where combat will occur. And we've got a two-map game here. So if I can get this thing unfolded without damaging it. There we go. Sorry about that. This happens to be the Ottoman Empire, Greece, Balkans area in southern Italy, but that won't matter. And you'll also see there's a world display over here that covers everything, including the Japanese. There's even a Japanese army in this game, and Navy. So this one's a pretty complex and complete game. The map is pretty high quality graphically. There's a lot of boxes and holding areas because, again, the activity occurs all over the world and you are responsible for activity all over the world. You'll notice that we have sea areas as well. So naval movement will be controlled by sea areas. Anyway, that's the Balkans and Middle East. This out of the way, and here's the other map, which in addition to the map has a good number of charts, tracks I should say, on it. If I can get it open here. There we go. Alright, and again, this is where the bulk of the combat occurs. Western Front, Italian Front, and Eastern Front over here. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Again, a pretty good complex map. There are some interesting things. If you notice this box here at the top, it is in fact a parliament box, because one of the things you'll have to do is decide as leader of your country how you're going to work with the parliament and what its motivation is. Like I said, it's a complex game and has a lot of things that you're going to be worrying about that wouldn't normally be true in a straight war game as we know them. The turn scale is basically, I believe it's basically a monthly turns, and it's a core level game for the most part. There are some other size units and lots of artillery and things like that, so we'll get into the units next. Okay, let's move those out of the way. We have, I got this used. I first heard about this game about 10 years ago, and immediately it went on my want list for war games to acquire. And then, coincidentally, or synchronicity-wise, this one became available about the time I started this World War I series, so I immediately grabbed a copy. But it's hard to find, and you can occasionally get it at Noble Knight Games, but basically this gives you some idea how the units work. We have individual leaders, even von der Goltz. This is the Ottoman Empire that you're looking at here, by the way. And it has the infantry units, it has some mountain units, it has aircraft, it has coastal artillery. The Ottomans didn't have much in the way of siege artillery. It has fortifications, corps headquarters. And these numbers in the corps headquarters, by the way, are the command range. The ability to influence combat is the second number, and the third number, I believe, is morale. And basically, the whole system is designed to emulate pretty much everything that you can deal with in terms of military operations, as well as the political actions that you have to take. Those political actions include, by the way, sending ambassadors and diplomats to countries to try and influence them to join your side. It includes, like I said, organizing your parliament and trying to convince them to back your war plans and so on. So basically, that gives you an idea what the unit counters look like. It's a fairly complete set of unit counters. Again, many of them have been punched in this copy. So bear with us, so you won't see a complete counter set the way we normally show. But again, oops, I'm sorry, I've got that upside down. My bad. Okay, we'll just flip this around and get rid of this one. So again, gives you some idea what you're dealing with here. This is the black are German, by the way. These are British and American. So again, nothing unusual in terms of colors or anything like that. The Germans do have siege artillery. They also have a large number of aircraft and zeppelins as well that you can work with. And of course, at the bottom, you see a good portion of their fleet. They also have U-boats. So again, all aspects of World War I are pretty well handled here. And you'll see basically the Army headquarters. These units represent heavy artillery, not regular artillery. And like I said, they do have siege guns as well, which is highly appropriate considering that's what was necessary at the beginning of the war. Anyway, that's a pretty good review of the units. Let's talk about the mechanics of the game now. This particular game has a lot of rules. Let's put it to you that way. So basically, when I bought this thing, I was sent 5 binders of rules. Okay, and there are that many booklets. There's also a number of charts and tables, too. We'll talk about those. But the 5 binders include all the different basic rules, which is what this book talks about. And this is basically the rules that apply throughout the game. Okay? That's an odd way to phrase it, I think. And the reason will become apparent shortly. But it basically talks, here's the list of contents over here, and basically you get a feel for how many different rules they're going to continue to work. And it has everything, including mobilization, production. Like I said, the politics are involved, and of course the standard military operations on land, sea, and air. So, gives you some idea. The rules, they're relatively clear, but remember they're translated from the French. So occasionally you'll run across some very awkward phrasing in the rules in the English translation. It probably helps if you're somewhat familiar with French military terms. That might help a little bit in interpreting some of this. But fundamentally, you're going to have to spend some time on this. You can see the portions of these rules are highlighted. Like I said, it's a used copy, of course. But it gives you some idea of how difficult some of the parts of the rules can be to interpret if you're not that familiar with French language, which, by the way, I am not. My languages were German and Russian, and that doesn't help much with this one. But the rules are well organized, and as long as you can puzzle out some of the awkward phrasing that results from translation, you'll be able to do everything you need to do with the rules. Zones of control, supply, all the things that are pretty basic. Movement, normal, and again that becomes important later on. Administrative movement, movement by rail. There's different kinds of movement. Administrative movement, by the way, normal movement is tactical movement. You're moving to contact or expecting to fight. Administrative movement is basically your road organized and following roads or rails to get to wherever you need to go. So we have reinforcements, discussion of the Air Force, artillery. Those things won't change much during the game. One of the odd features of this game, which is what we're going to talk about now, is the combat system. At the beginning of the game, you're in what's called the mobile phase, and they have one set of combat rules for that. After the mobile phase ends, let's say, I believe it's in March of 1915 or thereabouts, is what they officially consider the end of the mobile phase. You go into trench warfare, and it's a completely different set of combat rules. There are also a huge number of factors that are taken into account in combat, everything from morale, command and control, supply, organization. It's not just a comparison of attack factors to defense factors. There's a huge amount of modifiers, which again makes this game challenging for players that aren't particularly experienced. What you'll find, I think, is that if you'll play a few turns and then suddenly realize, oh, I did it wrong, and you'll have to start over, kind of like Campaign for North Africa. But again, you'll see it talks about how to do the bonus calculations on everything. There's a lot of moving parts. I think, honestly, this could have been simplified. It's an interesting approach because the mobile war phase versus the trench warfare phase were significantly different in execution. But, and this is just my opinion, so it's worth what you paid for it, I believe when you have to come up with two completely different combat rules sets, that's kind of a failure in design, in my opinion. However, it works. It does work, so it allows you to simulate things pretty effectively. It's just you gotta pay attention to the details and you gotta check your math. So, like I said, if I had to rate this on a complexity scale, like the one Decision Games or Compass Games uses, I'd rate this one right up there at 9 or 10 as far as complexity goes. Solitaire suitability, I would rate it actually fairly high as well, simply because of the complexity of the rules. Fog of War will be introduced into your game whether you like it or not, simply because of the rules. They have different information on different kinds of attacks, breakthroughs, counterattacks, strategic retreat, overruns. So there's a tremendous amount of diversity, if you will, in how the combat can be played out. And like I said, what you start with in the mobile war phase is somewhat more traditional to us as war gamers, but the trench warfare phase kind of shifts all those rules around and makes it more difficult to do anything in terms of combat movement or breakthroughs or anything like that, which is as it should be, of course. That is, in fact, true until the Stoßtruppen and the tanks come along, but it gives you some idea. One of the features of this game, which is fairly common to World War I games, is the national will tracking, so that you can, determine whether or not your country surrenders or folds. National will generally decrease as the war goes on because millions are dying and it's just not turning out to be as happy as everybody thought it would. So generally speaking, that'll continue to go down. But you'll see that there's points that you lose for national will and points that you can gain for national will. For example, if you capture an enemy capital, you gain 8 points to your national will. But generally speaking, you'll tend to lose national will more consistently than you will gaining it. Unlike other World War I games that we've looked at, the national will is also, like I said, affected by internal and external politics, so you have to pay attention to that. The war in the colonies is covered in a semi-abstract way. We do have a world map on there, and the Japanese and Chinese and people like that can get involved, and the armies are present in the counter set to allow you to do that. So nothing particularly unfamiliar to us as war gamers, but like I said, the way they've handled the combat system is different from the way most war games do. I guess I'm a follower of the Jim Dunnigan theory that if you have to have two different sets of rules for combat, you've probably done a bad set of rules for combat. However, this, like I said, does work. It's just incredibly complex. One of the things that we talk about, of course, in this game is fortresses, as we should. They played a significant role in the campaign early on, and in fact influenced how the trench lines were created as well. So again, all the details are here. It's just amazing. They also have some player notes, what we would call that. They call it game advice, and it gives you some discussion on different things that you can do to change the outcome or improve your play. And that's always nice. It's always nice to have those. So you can see they talk about trench warfare from 1915 to 1917. Keep in mind that beginning in 1917, the Germans began to develop and execute Stoßtruppen and special artillery tactics to break the stalemate. And the first exercise was on the Russian front in taking Riga, but of course expanded that into what became the Kaiserschlacht in 1918. Meanwhile, the Allies, British especially, were developing tank units to break the stalemate in their way. And then, of course, the Americans show up, which provides a huge boost in firepower and combat power for the Western Allies. So that's the basic rules. Next one up is the Trench Rules booklet. And here we go, Trench Warfare, 1915 to 1918. And what it does is it lays out the ways the system changes from the mobile warfare. Table of contents, you see there's a huge amount of information here, and it talks about everything that you're going to do. The sequence of play changes, not significantly, but in some ways, and national will changes a little bit, and so on and so forth. So you're going to see, again, there's significant changes when we transition to trench warfare. If you want to think about it this way, the mobile warfare phase was classic military operations. But what happened in 1915 to 1918 was, in effect, continent-wide siege warfare. So what they've really done is broken up this into a kind of a siege warfare description. And that seems appropriate. And I'm just going to flip through this fairly quick. They talk about different trench levels and so on, how losses are tracked, secondary battles. Again, they try to simulate operations on a semi-tactical scale almost, with the initial attack, counterattack, secondary attack, if possible, exploitation phase. And so, again, a lot of moving parts, a lot of calculations to determine what's going on. It can be challenging if you're not familiar with it. Interesting topic here, war weariness reaction, again affecting national morale, national will, because like I said, people get tired of losing their relatives over the course of 3 or 4 years, and gradually national will erodes because people are sick and tired of the war. They also are affected by the war in other ways, in terms of personal effects like food rationing and so on. Political effects, again, adapted to the trench warfare phase of the war. And it talks about patriotic reaction to changes in politics. And I'm telling you, everything is in here. Like I said, you have parliamentary elections, for crying out loud. Even the Irish Rebellion. So it's really a thorough game. It's why I called it kind of the golden fleece of World War I games, is because this is kind of the ultimate simulation of World War I, if you want to look at it that way. It's very complete, very complex, but it covers everything that went on during the war. So, again, that's the trench warfare booklet. And like I said, that's the bulk of the game, actually. Then we have the advanced rules. Isn't that special? And this one basically modifies and gets into the politics more. Parliament and the press, for crying out loud. Your government, political actions that your parliament can undertake, how the press influences those things, exceptional actions. Again, kind of a poor translation, basically special actions that you can undertake during the war. And again, those things, this is where in Death in the Trenches they had something like 400 random events that occur broken up by year. This doesn't do that. What it does is it generates random events through the political system, most of which are actually pretty close to what really happened in World War I. There will be variations, of course, which is good because it adds to replay value, but gives you some information on this. Additional advanced rules and cover things like war production, technology increase, poison gas, better planes, tanks, things like that, motorization, which was something that they pursued gradually over time. We talked about the air forces already. The details of production, how you collect materials in order to produce, and then how you produce what you want to produce, building units, building ships, building planes, building zeppelins, whatever. It's all in there. Talks about the blockade. Remember, the Central Powers suffered from a blockade from day one of the war, when the British basically imposed a distant blockade on Europe. And the upshot is that the Central Powers, unless they can somehow break the blockade, have weaker production than they would otherwise, because they can't get the raw materials they necessarily need to do the job. It's one reason why the Germans never attacked the Netherlands or the Denmark, Norway, Sweden region, because a lot of their raw materials were being drawn from that area, and it was better to keep them neutral and have the supplies continue to flow than it was to, in fact, engage in occupation and dealing with it like they did in World War II. Submarine warfare in the rest of the world. This is the part that addresses colonial wars and how to play it. A rule for Russian winter. You gotta love that. So, how to conduct naval warfare, the naval phase, war at sea in general, sortie at sea. Again, they try to recreate the Battle of Jutland using these rules, and they're actually very similar to the game Jutland in a lot of ways, but somewhat more refined. But again, it generates the possibility of a naval clash, which can affect national morale, because if you lose a bunch of battleships in a naval combat, it doesn't reflect well on you. So, details on how to fight a naval battle, effects of a naval battle, and again, they're talking politically, morale-wise, national will, so on and so forth. And let's see what else we got. Sea transport and sea landings. Of course, we got to have Gallipoli, right? Coastal raids, and we do have coastal artillery, by the way. The Germans actually conducted several raids along the British coast during the war. They'd come in and shell some town, but they weren't very well planned because they never really struck anything important. But had they spent some more time doing some target analysis, they might have come up with better targets to attack. And then there's the category that we all love, miscellaneous. And then there's a list of the political regimes that can affect each country, and it basically, the interaction of the political regimes has a lot to do with how the war progresses, because, depending on your political regime, you may or may not be able to conduct certain attacks. If your government isn't all in on the war, you might have to hold back a little bit and exercise some caution in engaging. We also have Russian Revolution rules, fairly extensive, including mutinies of the military. Separate peace with Russia, separate peace with Austria-Hungary, special rules for that. A lot of special rules, a lot of chrome in this game. As a general rule, a good solid basic game covers the activity that goes on in the war, and that's super. But the more chrome you add, the more complex the game is, and the more difficult it is to play. So there's a ton of chrome in this. We have combat playing aid, which gives you some idea. You almost are like playing the battle out on this sheet instead of on the hex, because you got to keep track of where everything is and then determine how it flows from there. We have analysis of units. I'm going to let you take a look at this for a couple of minutes because it gives you some idea of the variety and how to read the units. So, for example, we have this corps here is the 20th Corps belonging to the 7th or 8th Army, rather. It has a fire value, a morale value, and then it has attack, defense, and movement, which are fairly standard. The flip side is reduced to the value of the counter, and they have a little symbol there so you know. They have a description of the different morale levels for the units, give you some feel for that. Lots of different kinds of artillery. We have heavy artillery, siege artillery, coastal artillery, and river artillery. Different headquarters, including a headquarters general in general type unit, usually Army level, but also the GHQ. So again, these are Austrian units that you're seeing here, but they're all pretty much handled the same way. And you'll see the values here: initiative, combination, and reaction. And down here, it's command range, intervention, and movement for the Army. So the GHQ will sit in your capital or wherever you locate it, and you can relocate it by rail movement, but that's about it. Fortifications, you can see the support value for the fortification for any battle that occurs in its X, its defense value, and its resistance number, which affects how easily it is destroyed. And then we have individual generals here as well. Commander-in-Chief is here. An army commander basically is there, and it gives you some idea of how the numbers work for that as well. So again, complexity exists on the counters too. There's a lot of information here that you have to pay attention to. The reserve number, for example, is how many corps you can keep in reserve and controlled by that headquarters. Flipping here, we've got some other units. Well, we've got a bomber, fighter type unit, and Zeppelin, and the numbers are dogfight, protection, and range. You can see that the fighters have a pretty good dogfight value and protection value. The bombers don't have a dogfight value, and the Zeppelins don't either, so it kind of gives you a feel for how it looks. There's different types of missions you can engage in: recon, tactical support, and strategic bombing, and those evolve over the course of the game. You begin with recon and then gradually develop tactical support and strategic bombing missions. We have a special unit here in the form of tanks. It gives max support value, and the other values are the same. And the Stoßtruppen units to give you some idea of how the infiltration will work. So, and naval, we have an admiral here, and a ship gives you some values there. This set of rules here are basically a simplification. I'm not even going to use that term because it doesn't really apply here, but basically this assembles key points of information that you need to remember in as a player aid to help you navigate the turn sequence and the different rules that apply. We have Movement War 1914 battle aid here as well to kind of give you the ability to work through the combat. Think of it as a very fancy checklist because that's kind of what it is. You have to follow the process pretty carefully. It will become more of a second nature kind of thing as the war progresses. Trust me on that. But the first few turns of both mobile and trench warfare are going to be something that you really need to pay attention to the sequence of play on. So be prepared for that. We have here combat charts of various kinds. And notice, here's our combat chart. Here's all the different kinds of modifications that can apply to that combat chart. And clearly, that's a lot of stuff that you're going to be dealing with, a lot of variables that are going to come into play as you calculate the odds and execute the combat. And again, it works. It does work. It provides actually a pretty accurate simulation of what the results of combat were, but it's a certain amount of work that you have to be prepared to do. Continuing with the charts, bombardment. You can conduct bombardments, of course, before you launch an offensive. And remember, historically, some of those bombardments proceeded for weeks, days definitely, weeks in some cases, and in a couple of cases when the Allies were attacking for a month or more before the attack actually went on. The Germans tended to go with shorter bombardments because they preferred to not alert the enemy to where the attack was coming, but it gives you some idea of what they're dealing with. And we have reinforcement charts here, gives a feel for how that works. We have mandatory offensives as well. Sometimes your government requires you to launch an offensive, even if other times it suggests that you not. We have the naval rules here, coastal raid over here, what we call minefields, coastal artillery effects on ships. It's all there. It's all there. Ships range from battleships down to torpedo boats and destroyers, but also submarines, as we said. There will be a U-boat war thing. Player aid for the naval mission. Again, a huge checklist that you have to follow pretty much to make sure that the naval combat is played correctly. We get into submarine warfare, and the blockade chart kind of gives you a feel for how things go. Weather does affect things, not only on land and in air, but also at sea, and it's taken into account. Next, we get to, we have diplomacy charts here. Next, we get into the entry into war, August 1914. And what this basically does, lays out initial placement, but also each country is provided with a list of effects that they suffer from or receive, depending on whether they're good or bad, and some decisions they have to make. So, for example, are you going to go all out in offensive in France as the Germans? Or are you going to hold back and try to shift troops to the east? It's and there's consequences for those decisions politically and diplomatically. So it's, again, a fairly detailed approach to how things are working. And talks about diplomacy during the war in 1914. And again, diplomacy changes as the war goes on. We have a section on diplomacy from peace to war. You actually go through the mobilization process here, which, by the way, gives you an opportunity, once you've played it a few times, to develop your own mobilization plans. Something that Jim Dunnigan did in 1914 that was published by Avalon Hill back in the 70s. So, again, you have opportunities to play with variables. France. This one discusses the French offensive in August, shock tactics, all the different things that are going to affect how the French resolve combat. Note the blue-red uniform effect on the French. Okay, their uniforms at the beginning of the war were highly colorful, which is a really bad idea if you're going to charge machine guns, it turns out. It talks about this French 75, which was arguably the best field cannon in the during the war, and in fact was still in use into World War II. We have a pre-turn that the French have to execute in certain ways. There's discussion about the effects of German invasion of Belgium and all this. This is just the French. I mean, pages of information on how the French are going to go in 1914. Next, we come to French war plans and options. You get to choose what plan you're going to follow. And the last one here is the open French plan. That's basically design your own plan, which, again, gives you opportunities. Russia here, war plans. Gives some discussion of them. Germany, war plans. Several pages of them. Austria-Hungary, war plans, options. And remember, the Austrians had a very confusing setup going. Diplomacy, misspelled, that should be embassies, but anyway, the bottom line is that you can engage in diplomacy with different countries as the war goes on. So here's the Central Powers. Italy is, of course, turns out to be an ally, though initially going in they were theoretically an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And again, the main countries that you can affect and different things that you can do to affect them and their likelihood of joining the war. Talks about major powers again, so we're discussing England now with all their worldwide commitments, which are taken into account. Italy, Turkey. Turks have some interesting commitments as well in terms of their empire, which, like I said, was somewhat frayed by this time historically. Then we go into minor countries. Let's start off with Afghanistan. That gives you, again, some idea of what you're dealing with. We have Denmark, we have Spain, we have China. Again, all these countries can and will affect the course of the war. Holland, Japan, Mexico, Greece, Switzerland. Interestingly, they've included it for completion, but no diplomacy is allowed. So Norway, Portugal, Romania, Persia. Gotta love that. Serbia, Sweden, so on and so forth. Okay. The diplomacy chart again, so that you can see how the diplomatic interactions work. And now we get into events, because again, there are events in this game as well. Some of the, like I said, the systems will generate some events, but some are also provided. So that gives you some feel for just how complex and detailed this game really is. One of the questions that you're going to have at the end, and we'll try to answer here at the end, is playability of this game, and we'll talk about that. We get into social tests. Basically, as the war goes on, you have to engage in these things to determine how your nation's government and population are supporting the war, national will, and so on and so forth affect these diplomatic events, special events, activities, consequences of combat, etc. all affect how these things go. Technologies. So we have a starting baseline, if you will, but you can expand that, and this gives you opportunities to improve your forces, if you will. Note down here, for example, fire through propeller disc is one of the technologies, basically the interrupter gear that was developed to allow machine guns to fire straight from the through the propellers, so that they didn't have to do something weird to engage each other. And that goes on fairly lengthy. There are a number of technologies that were developed, poison gas, for example, and so on. Let's see, we have I'm not sure, end of turn. So different adjustments that happen during the end of turn phase. Basically, think of this as a vastly expanded end of game turn phase. It appears in other war games. Usually it's a brief maintenance thing where you adjust markers on tracks or whatever. But in this case, it's a little more complex, not surprising. And we also have an interphase discussion, because there is an interphase between the turns as well, where you negotiate, you deal with your different actions that occur beyond the combat system. This is the political actions table, which tells you what you can do and what kinds of effects it might have. And again, there is randomization here in the form of a die roll, so it goes on for 2 pages. We have more events here. Excuse me. So let's see, LGG chronology, the Grande Guerre chronology. In other words, basically, again, the initial phases that you play through to start the game before you actually even engage in the turn sequence. And then a discussion of how you get into the turn sequence. What happens in August, what happens in September, October, and so on. So again, the mobile phase is pretty rigidly controlled in some ways because you're going to spend the bulk of the war in the trench warfare phase, and they give you a lot more controlling detail on the mobile war because of that. They talk about the events that occur during interphases as well. So, covers the length of the war. Summary of the game system. This is actually fairly useful. It's also fairly necessary, but again, it suffers a little bit from translation drift, if you will. So this is one of those areas where you're going to spend some time online researching on Consim World and Board Game Geek and places like that to find clarifications and better instructions and comments and so on. So be prepared to spend some time doing a little bit of research the first time you play this game, or prepare to play this game. And that discussion goes on for pages and pages as well. So that's the charts and tables. And then we get to the fun stuff in the terms of scenarios. Because guess what? We also have scenarios to deal with. Obviously, the initial scenario is the grand scenario. That's the whole war. So I'll give you some feel for that. Discusses everything that goes on with the different powers involved, how they set up, what their national will is, production points available, where the units are, and what kinds of units are where. And it pretty much deals country by country with that. So that's a fairly complete scenario set of instructions. We also have a 1914 scenario. We're only going to basically play from the end of July through the end of the year. And again, the idea is this was a fascinating part of the game, and theoretically you could win, with a strategic victory right off the bat. But in point of fact, it generally devolves into maneuvering both globally and locally to improve your position for the coming trench warfare phase. One of the problems with the artificiality between the combat systems is that you're going to go into trench warfare, which is something the actual participants didn't until it happened. But that means that it becomes kind of a gamey thing where you prep, you plan for trench warfare, which changes how you operate. And again, it gives you some ideas. Then we have the 2 pages stuck together. Talks about the East, so on and so forth, the West. Scenario instructions for that scenario. Then we have the 1916 to 1918 scenario, basically trench warfare for a couple of years. And goes into some detail on that. This is basically the status quo, and the purpose of this scenario for you as a player is to try and break that status quo, whether politically or militarily. You'll get the huge offensives that the Allies threw to try and break the German army while the Germans were trying to break the Russians in the East. A good number of the offensives in the West, by the way, were triggered off by the Allies trying to prevent the Germans from committing their forces to the Russians. They wanted to keep Russia in the war. The reason for that, of course, is the Russians' front is a vast front tying down large numbers of troops. And pretty much goes into detail on the different countries for that scenario. So, again, in some detail. Interestingly, we have a discussion of the different generals that are available. Henri Philippe Pétain, Belgium, Albert, King of the Belgians, Putnik for the Serbians, and these are all historical figures, and they're rated subjectively, of course, because such ratings always are, but they feel right to me as an observer. It feels like these numbers appropriately quantify the abilities of the generals involved. So, for whatever that's worth, your mileage may vary. And then the Azure Wish was the company that actually did this in the original thing. So basically, it talks about different things that they chose to do and how they did them. So that's pretty much the game. So, is it playable? Yes. However, you're going to spend some time on it. This is not a beer and pretzels game. This is a complex war game with a lot of moving parts, militarily, politically, diplomatically, and on different fronts: naval, air, land, Eastern Front, Western Front, Balkan Front, Middle Eastern fronts, and all of it requires your attention to detail. So if you're going to play this, I would recommend a couple of things. As I said, the playability rating, I would say, is not tremendously high. I would say playability might be a 3 or 4. It becomes worse if you try to do it by yourself. This is a game that begs for teams to play because each country really needs somebody that can focus on that country in its entirety. If you're trying to deal with the English, the French, the United States, and Russians as a single player, you're going to miss things. You're going to fail to notice opportunities. You're going to misapply rules. I guarantee it. It's human nature. There's just too many balls in the air for you to juggle them successfully. So if you're going to play this, I strongly recommend you get teams to play it. A team experience, I think, would be amazing. I haven't had that, obviously, but I've just played around pushing some units along the map and seeing how combat worked. I haven't tried to play a scenario yet, but I will tell you this. I think this game would reward team play. I think you'd have a tremendous amount of fun. You could think of it as a cross between a complex World War I game, military, naval and air game, colonial combat game, and a game like diplomacy. You're going to be negotiating with different players to do different things. And at the end of the day, I think it would be an amazingly rewarding experience. But be prepared to invest some time. Solitaire suitability, like I said, in some ways I'd rate it like 7 or 8 even, because you will lose track of events in this. Like I said, it's very similar to CNA, Campaign for North Africa, in that sense. There's so many moving parts that you're going to miss stuff and the fog of war will grow. That's not really the way we want to play games, of course, but it will affect that. Ease of play, especially if you're doing it solitaire, is not high. I'd give it a 1 maybe, because if you're doing it solitaire, you're juggling everybody on both sides. And it's just, there's so many variables. I can't imagine succeeding at that. Having said that, I think it's an experience that would be rewarding. I think that this is a kind of game that where you plan to set it up for several months, playing every weekend and enjoying yourselves as you explore the possibilities in this game. And one of the things that I play war games for, and probably most of you do, is to explore possibilities. What would have happened if we'd done this differently? And this game is going to give you an opportunity to explore possibilities for different activities in every realm. It's honestly the most complete and one of the most complex war games out there for World War I. Depends on what your sweet spot for gaming is, but I like complexity. And for me, this really is kind of the golden fleece for World War I games. For you, your mileage may vary, but, for what it's worth, that's my opinion. That's a discussion of the game. If you have any questions or comments, please include them below. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. And we will answer your questions. We do pay attention. Also, if you have any further recommendations for other things, we're going to continue to go through the World War I thing. We've got like 27 more games to go through, believe it or not. But we do try to intersperse other activities and other videos in between these. So let us know what you're interested in seeing. And that pretty much concludes today's edition of our World War I review. I hope you enjoyed it.